A Social History of Anthropology in the United States by Thomas Patterson. Chapter 5. Anthropology in the Neoliberal Era, from 1947 to 2000. The crisis of American society during the last quarter of the 20th century has been shaped by the intersection of several interrelated processes. These include the breakdown of the unwritten post-war compromise between capital and labor, the rise to prominence of finance capital, economic reorganization, and implementation of neoliberal austerity programs, immigration, the stalling out of civil rights movement, and the appearance of new social movements rooted in identity politics, continued intervention in the internal affairs of third world countries, and the ongoing importance of Cold War policies even after the dissolution of the socialist states. The unwritten pact between capital and organized labor dating from the late 1940s. The capitalist class settled for aspects of the welfare state in return for labor peace. Labor agreed to participate in the capitalist growth economy shaped by the Cold War rhetoric and xenophobia in return for regular cost of living increases, inexpensive education, and other social benefits. The compromise, which was unstable from its inception, became even more so through the 1960s and 1970s, as serious reconstructing of the American economy eroded the underlying logic and the political alliances that sustained it. Terms such as deindustrialization, Rust Belt, offshoring, the new international division of labor, flexible production and accumulation, and post-Fordism were coined to describe the effects as industrial capital moved from the old industrial states in the Northeast to the southern states and third world countries where inexpensive, non-union labor was plentiful. The rise to prominence and hegemony of the finance sector by the early 1970s facilitated such transfers. The unilateral abrogation of the Bretton Woods Agreement by the United States in 1971 forced all of the capitalist states to subordinate every aspect of their economic policy to the defense of currency. This underwrote the emergence of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, both controlled by the United States, as major policy-making institutions whose experts promoted the development of the export-oriented economies in third world countries and advocated neoliberal policies such as deregulation, free markets, privatization, and austerity that facilitated the flow of capital. Deregulation of the American banking industry in the 1970s, coupled with tax concessions granted by federal, state, and local governments, and the steadily higher interest rates banks charged for loans and debt servicing, led to enormous profits by the middle of the decade. To increase profits even further, the banks made high-interest, high-risk loans to the second and third world countries seeking to implement IMF and the World Bank development strategies focused on export-oriented industries. By 1978, it appeared as if a number of less developed countries might default on loan repayments, which threatened the banks to their foundations. The banks responded to the threat by renegotiating some loans, writing off others, and forcing the governments involved to implement austerity programs that eliminated or severely curtailed the health, education, and welfare benefits enjoyed by their citizens. Austerity policies implemented in the United States also eliminated or weakened the safety net available to its citizens. More than 15 million immigrants entered the United States in 1969. The new arrivals, most from Latin America and Asia, were an internally diverse group. Well-educated Koreans and Chinese, impoverished second-wave Cambodian and Hmong families, and working-class men and women from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Immigrants were slotted into a hierarchically organized working class historically structured by race, ethnicity, and gender. Class relations were reorganized by the appearance of new groups composed of previously unconnected individuals who began to sense that they had something in common, and by the identity politics unleashed as a result of this growing awareness. The immigrants constituting the new people classes were aware that blacks, women, American Indians, Puerto Ricans, and gay men and lesbians were demanding recognition of rights and claims based on their identities. They participated in and were affected to varying degrees and in different ways by new social movements. The politics of the new social movements, like those of some civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s, celebrated differences and demanded recognition and rights because of them. Their goal was to ensure the survival of the community. Opponents of the collectivist goals of new social movements appeared almost immediately and rooted their claims in another strand of liberal social thought that gave precedence to the rights of individuals. They demanded that differences be ignored. Such claims and counterclaims were the starting points from which new forms of social consciousness and identity were constructed in the 1970s and 80s. There were buttresses by massive immigration and the changing complexion of large cities, coupled with deindustrialization, growing unemployment, and capital flight. The politics of the new social movements also fueled the culture wars of the last 30 years of the 20th century. The turn to Marx, 1974 to 1982. The development of anthropology training programs in the post-war era took place in a political economic milieu underpinned by sustained economic growth. This reality changed abruptly with the restructuring of the American economy from the late 1960s onward. This reorganization had devastating implications for higher education and for anthropology training programs. By the early 1970s, the costs of higher education were rapidly being shifted from state and federal governments to the individual. At the same time, many university budgets, when adjusted for inflation, had already stopped growing or were actually beginning to decline, conditions that have persisted to the end of the 20th century and beyond. By the mid-1970s, these no-growth budgets meant that college and university anthropology departments would no longer experience the sustained growth they had known since the early 1960s. New faculty were not added, and staff members who departed, retired, or died were not replaced. The increased resilience on the marginally paid part-time teachers quickly led to the formation of two-tier faculties composed of tenure-track slots and temporary positions with fewer benefits. The erosion of academic jobs was accompanied by a decline in levels of financial support available to graduate students. As a result, fewer students completed their doctorates. The number of PhD degrees awarded fell from 468 in 1975 to 402 the following year and remained at or below that level until 1992. Individuals with doctorates in anthropology were forced to seek employment outside of academy positions where they could apply the skills that they acquired in graduate school. For example, many students of archaeology found employment in the Cultural Resource Management Archaeology, which was created by federal legislation between 1966 and 1947. These laws laid the foundations for large bureaucracy that supervised the hundreds of private firms that were awarded money to record, recover, and preserve archaeological information in the United States. By 1980, an estimated 6,000 men and women worked on CRM projects that cost about $300 million a year. The new labor market that emerged in the mid-1970s onward was internally stratified. At the top were tenure-track academics, temporary teachers, and public and private sector employees occupied the lower rungs of the ladder. This internal stratification was sustained ideologically by all of the parties involved as they gave priority to pure applied research and chose to ignore the conditions that underpin the hierarchically ordered labor market in which they were participants. The changes in the labor market were reflected in the membership lists of the American Anthropological Association that were published yearly in the annual report during the 1970s and the Anthropology newsletter from the 1980s onward. These numbers indicate that the AAA, which had 4,678 individual members in 1967, grew rapidly to 7,750 members in 1973, then more slowly to 8,404 members in 1976. The membership then fell steadily to 6,486 individuals in 1983. The association has grown every year since then and now has more than 11,000 members. An increasing number and percentage of those entering the labor market from the late 1970s and early 1980s onward were women. For example, the number of PhD degrees awarded to anthropology doubled from about 150 in the late 1960s to 300 in 1970. Women earned 28% of the degrees awarded that year. 13 years later, they received 46% of the 403 PhD degrees granted by American universities. This fact has several implications. One is that the steadily growing number of women entered the anthropological labor market during the period when it was being rapidly transformed. A second implication is that many of these women, regardless of their qualifications, were employed disproportionately as temporary or part-time teachers in the academy or as practicing anthropologists working outside the academy. In other words, many of them were forced by circumstances beyond their control to work in jobs viewed by the profession as less desirable than full-time, tenure-track positions in research universities. The privileging of academic over non-academic labor still plagues the field today. Two of the three perspectives, symbolic anthropology and broadly economistic, sometimes ecological systems, or process evolutionism, honed and refined by American anthropologists during the 1970s, could not account adequately or at all for the conditions that were created by new labor market. Only the Marxist perspective had the theoretical tools required to do so. In fact, much of the work in the late 1970s can be understood as a part of an ongoing dialogue between anthropologists inspired by Marx and those who were not. The fluorescence of symbolic anthropology in the mid-1970s depended on the adoption of a perspective that the distinguished culture from society, that viewed culture narrowly as a system of symbols and meanings, and that allowed culture to be studied as an autonomous domain. Such a perspective was originally suggested by Alfred Kroeber and Thomas Patterson in the late 1950s, was widely held by the 1970s. It was based on the belief that culture, the system of symbols and meanings which had a role in shaping the meaningful activity engaged in by people, could not be reduced to some other system. This implied, as David Schneider observed, that if one accepts the view that culture is an irreducible construct, one must also accept, in principle, some general social theory, for example, Parsons' theory of social action. Of course, the study of culture can articulate with theories other than the one developed by Parsons, but I would insist that to study culture without reference to some broader social theory is a pointless endeavor. Schneider, Clifford Geertz, and Victor Turner, all of whom were at the University of Chicago, used this viewpoint to develop distinctive versions of symbolic anthropology. Geertz's interpretive anthropology was characterized by the adoption of Parsons' theory of social action and by the infusion of arguments developed by phenomenologists, notably Edmund Husserl, Paul Ricoeur, and Alfred Schutz, Culture, in Gert's opinion, consisted of the systems of public symbols by which the members of a society communicated meaning to one another in the course of significant social activity. Cultural systems, for such exchanges to occur, must have at least a minimal degree of coherence. There was, in Durkheim's terms, a degree of consensus or solidarity, meaning culture is thus constituted in the course of symbolic or social action, as acting social beings are trying to make sense of the world in which they find themselves. Culture is not some abstractly ordered system deriving its logic from hidden structural principles or from special symbols that provide the keys to its coherence. Its logic. The principles of relations that obtain among its elements derives rather from the logic or organization of action, from people operating within certain institutional orders, interpreting their situations in order to act coherently within them. The version of symbolic anthropology developed by Schneider and his associates took a slightly different track. They too combined the idea that culture was a system of symbols and meanings with Parsons' theory of social action. They argued that social action was orderly and understandable for both participants and observers, and that social life, which is made up of people, actions, things, relationships, and institutions, had a degree of coherence for those who lived it out in its particularity. Unlike Gertz, however, they tied social action and social life to an underlying, broadly Marxist perspective. They did not grant primacy in symbolic action to either the formal structures of collective representations or the individual processes of understanding, interpretation, adjustment, and expression. They focused on the social processes in which these two sorts of force interact. The social relations of communication and interpretation, and those properties of symbolic system itself, and of the social system of which the symbolic system is a part, which give coherence to communication, which either stabilize the symbolic order or which may change in it regular. The fact that such change is regular is proven by the fact that even during periods of the most radical symbolic change, we have very little problem understanding each other. In their view, change is the natural state of existence of societies, which we know now not to be a succession of forms, but of arenas in which the process of formation of the social order itself is perpetually taking place. For Marx, as for Hegel, the meaningfulness of social action for actors is part and parcel of their creation in thought and action of a social world, of what Ludwig Wittgenstein called a mode of life. In Marx's words, as people express their life, so they are. The foundations for Schneider's symbolic anthropology were his empirical studies of American kinship. He viewed the ideology of American kinship as a cultural system that was based on a distinction between the pure domain of kinship, defined in terms of the symbol of coitus and differentiated into two major aspects: relationships as a natural substance and a relationship as a code for conduct, and a conglomerate domain of kinship differentiated into the family on one hand and an articulated system of person-defined statuses on the other. The symbolic ties of substance, blood, and shared codes of conduct between persons defined social groups and shaped action between their members and with outsiders. Schneider further argued that these concepts were in turn organized around the more encompassing core symbols of nature and rationality, that collectively they unregarded relations of recruitment with regard not only to kinship but also to nationality and religion. The issues that Schneider and his associates raised were why certain symbols continually recreated in the course of meaningful action, and how did they come to be seen as real or natural and imbued with a sense of inevitability. In Marxist terms, How were these abstractions refined and converted into sets of understandings that were repeated and reproduced by social actors? They were not concerned, as Gertz was, with how symbolic forms were used by native and anthropologists to interpret particular episodes of social action, but rather how certain symbolic forms, or sets of understandings about things, were shaped by the desires of actors, became hegemonic and dominant in particular societies. This version of symbolic anthropology, developed by Victor Turner, was not rooted in Parsons' theory of social action, informed by Marxist social thought. It was reaction against the structural functionalist assumptions that cultural systems have a high degree of coherence, that consensus prevails in society, and that societies are harmoniously integrated as a result. In Turner's view, societies were shaped by conflict and contradiction. Like Schneider and his associates, Turner was interested in the dynamics and processes of symbolic action. He was concerned with how, in particular events, symbols can be detached from abstract systems of symbols, with which they have previously been connected and hooked in to new ad hoc combinations of symbols to constitute, legitimate, or undermine programs and protocols for collective action. He was also concerned with the social and historical processes by means of which symbols retained, added, or shed meaning in times of crisis. Another focus of Turner's symbolic anthropology was to determine the ways in which symbols put together in rituals performed in particular circumstances resolved social contradictions by bringing actors into line with norms of the society. Here he examined the spontaneous grouping or comunitas that often appeared suddenly among marginal or liminal peoples, such as the Millerian movements that emerged among poor peoples or tribal peoples as they were enmeshed in tributary relations in some state-based society. The second strand of anthropological thought that crystallized during the 1970s and the early 1980s was more concerned with the practical than the symbolic coordinates of human activity. Its proponents, sometimes described as the Columbia-Michigan axis, saw culture as not superorganic, but rather as means by which human populations maintain themselves in ecological systems. Culture, in their view, was simultaneously the product of rational human beings interacting with one another, each attempting to maximize or optimize their own interests, and an instrument for reproducing or maintaining the human population within certain Malthusian limits. The ecological anthropologists built on earlier work of Julian Stewart and Leslie White. The various neo-functionalist, neo-evolutionist perspectives constituting this viewpoint range from ecological anthropology and cultural materialism on the one hand, to the concerns of new archaeologists with the rise of civilization and the origin states on the other. Its idiom included explanatory terms such as adaptation, system, feedback, homeostasis, carrying capacity, population pressure, evolution, and process. Unlike Stewart or White, whose unit of analysis was culture, ecological anthropologists such as Roy Rappert or Andrew Veda were concerned with populations, aggregates of autonomous human beings whose culture and forms of social organization allowed them to adapt to the natural environments in which they lived and to make use of resources offered by their real and perceived environments. These human populations were constituent parts of an ecosystem along with other species and resources. Like other populations, they captured energy from these relatively passive environments and reproduced in ways and numbers that tended to maintain the balance between themselves and the world in which they lived. This emphasis on how human populations survived and reproduced focused attention on nutrition, subsistence, and demography, as their members went about acquiring the resources they needed for everyday life. The ecological anthropologists believed that cultural practices such as the potlatch of the Northwest Coast were adaptations that maintained the ecosystem in a homeostatic or dynamic equilibrium by redistributing food and other resources from peoples living in areas of relative abundance to those living in areas of relative scarcity. Explaining cultural change was a problem for the neo-functionalists. In their perspective, change occurred when some force impinged on the system from the outside and disrupted its equilibrium conditions. For example, Kent Flannery, who introduced systems theory to new archaeology, explained the shift from a food-collecting economy to one based on incipient cultivation in terms of a series of genetic changes which took place in one or two species of Mesoamerican plants which were of use to man. The exploitation of these plants had been a relatively minor procurement system, but a positive feedback following these initial genetic changes causes one minor system to grow all of the proportion to others and eventually change the whole ecosystem. Flannery subsequently explored the cultural evolution of civilians, states or those human societies that have evolved to levels of great socio-political complexity. After describing antecedent forms of socio-political organization, bands, tribes, and chiefdoms, he portrayed the state as a social type with a centralized government, a professional ruling class, social stratification, occupational specialization, monopoly of force, rule by law, and economic structures controlled by elites and characterized by reciprocal, redistributive, and market exchanges. States appeared because of the complex relationships and feedback among a series of variables or prime movers. State formation was a long, slow process that involved increased internal differentiation and specialization of the cultural subsystems and denser linkages between the various subsystems and the highest order controls of the society. He wrote that the mechanisms and processes by which states emerge are universal, not merely of human society, but in the evolution of complex systems in general. The socio-environmental stresses which select for those mechanisms are not necessarily universal, but may be specific to particular regions and societies. In other words, when socio-environmental stresses impinge on the adaptive milieu, evolutionary mechanisms change the relationships among the higher and lower order controls that regulate the system. These mechanisms had the capacity to promote further stress and instability and to trigger social pathologies, two of which were usurpation and meddling, that underwrote even further transformations of the system. In Flannery's view, the evolution of civilizational systems was a slow, gradual, and continuous process of the internal responses and adaptations, first to external socio-environmental stresses, and then to the sociopathologies that developed. The effect was that the components of the cultural system were the optimal or best compromise solutions at any given moment to the problems produced by the natural or social environments. While neo-functionalists explained the change in terms of exogenous factors, cultural materialists, such as Marvin Harris or Mark Cohen, resorted to neo-Malthusian arguments. In their view, when a population surpassed the carrying capacity of its environment, some form of technological or organizational innovation was required to maintain it at its new level or density. Thus, Cohen explained the origin and development of agriculture in terms of population growth and the reliance on more intensive forms of land or resource utilization. He wrote that human population has been growing throughout its history, and that such growth is the cause, rather than the result, of much human progress or technological change. While hunting and gathering is an extremely successful mode of adaptation for small hunting groups, it is not well adapted to support large or dense human populations. I suggest, therefore, that the development of agriculture was an adjustment which human populations were forced to make in response to their own increasing numbers. Agriculture is not easier than hunting and gathering, and it does not provide a higher quality, more palatable, or secure food base. It has only one advantage, of providing more calories. It will thus be practiced only when necessitated by population pressure. As the weaknesses of the ecosystem's approach, its emphasis on functional integration and self-regulation, and its difficulty in dealing with change became increasingly apparent in the late 1970s. Many of the ecological anthropologists and new archaeologists shifted their attention toward the analysis of individual decision-making and historical processes. This forced them to confront once again the specificity of the historical record and how people made their own history under conditions not of their own making. It has also led many of them to examine critically how their own theoretical perspectives resonated with those of Marxist scholars whose work was developing along several different lines. Dependence in theory and subsequently world systems theory formed one bridge with Marxist social thought. Dependency theory, popularized in the United States during the late 1960s and early 1970s by Chicago-trained economist Andre Gunderfrank, was a critique of mainstream modernization and development theory. Frank had argued that the forms of economic development in the third world countries, such as Chile or Brazil, were a historical product of past and continuing economic and other relations between the underdeveloped satellite and the now developed metropolitan cities. These relations were exploitative ones that drained economic surplus from the satellites and impregnated their domestic economies with the same capitalist structures and contradictions found in the Western industrialized countries. Historical sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein continued the analysis of unequal exchange in his influential The Modern World System, the first volume which appeared in 1947. Wallerstein argued that the world economies linked by exchange relations were largely impossible before about 1500, because the bureaucracies of the constituent states absorbed surplus and precluded its accumulation for investment. The capitalist world economy, which appeared around 1500, coincided with the expansion of commerce. By virtue of a series of accidents, the states of northwestern Europe were able to impose a regional division of labor and specialization of production: sugar in the Caribbean, bullion in the Andes, and cereals in Western Europe, and through increasingly powerful state bureaucracies to consolidate the flow of surplus toward the core countries. Joseph Jorgensen was the first American anthropologist to use dependency theory to examine the development of underdevelopment in Western United States. He focused not only on North American Indian economies, but also on the consolidation and concentration of agricultural production in the hands of a steadily decreasing number of increasingly larger corporations. He showed that the same processes underpinned Indian battles for sovereignty, Chicano and Black protests about police brutality, and the steadily progressing immiseration of rural Anglos in the many parts of the West. These were the rapacious development policies of corporations that were supported by federal, state, and local officials who enacted legislation that placed the burden of economic growth disproportionately on the members of the most marginalized communities and classes in the area. He wrote, "Whether at the hands of railroads, agribusiness, mining companies, or timber corporations, development has brought immense human suffering and environmental degradation to both Native American and Anglo communities. Today, many of those communities are skeptical of the promises of energy corporations and government officials and are seeking alternative models for revitalizing rural areas. Social scientists, if they so choose, can collaborate with Western tribes and communities in formulating and promoting these models." The turn toward radical and Marxist analyses coincided with the changes of the empirical base of the discipline, the fieldwork situation. These changes were underwritten by 1. The undergoing decolonization of third world countries, 2. The reorientation of funding opportunities towards social problems in the United States, 3. The politicization of Native Americans at home and abroad, and 4. The emergence of various Indigenous and advocacy groups, including the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs in 1968 and the Cultural Survival in 1972. One advocacy group, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, founded in 1975, coined the term Fourth World to refer to the disenfranchised Aboriginal peoples engulfed by nation-states, and called for the industrial states to re-examine their concepts of and claims to land, citizenship, and nation, in light of the cultural values and sentiments expressed in the arguments of the Fourth World. While the Council issued a moral challenge, and the Six Nations Iroquois went further and called for anthropologists for a critical analysis of the West's historical processes to seek out the actual nature of the roots of the exploitative and oppressive conditions which were forced on humanity. Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History and Stanley Diamond's In Search of the Primitive, A Critique of Civilization, were early responses to such appeals. Wolf and Diamond developed different facets of Marxist social thought during the 1970s. Unlike Wallerstein's world systems theory, which stressed the importance of unequal exchange between core and periphery, Wolf emphasized the importance of social relations that structured the organization of production and the distribution of goods and labor within and between societies. He organized his discussion of the different social systems and varied cultural understandings that Europe would encounter in the course of its expansion in terms of Marx's concept of the mode of production in order to annihilate the cultural processes at work in the interaction of Europeans with the majority of the world's peoples. Wolf's analysis resonated with a wider debate that was taking place at the time among anthropologists inspired by Marxist social thought. The debate was concerned with whether the conceptual framework that Marx used to analyze the development of industrial capitalism was also applicable to the non-capitalist societies traditionally studied by anthropologists. Wolf and other American anthropologists, notably Janet Siskind and Eleanor Leacock, concluded that it was applicable with modification and clarification in the light of anthropological inquiries to the study of band and tribal societies. Wolf's analysis of the political economy of capitalist world bore similarities to the structural Marxism or Marxist structuralism being discussed in Europe, and the emphasis he placed on the system as complexly structured whole manifesting the articulation of societies with different modes of production and culture that define the deployment of social labor, which set the terms of history. In his view, the motor for the rise of international capitalism was located in the West, and the system itself was built on exploitation, enslavement, genocide, and the formation of class structures and states. It also involved ethnogenesis, the creation of peoples without history both inside and outside Europe. Stanley Daniels' more dialectical analysis of capitalist civilization captured this dynamic in different words. Civilization originates in conquest abroad and repression at home. Each is an aspect of each other. Anthropologists who use or misuse words such as acculturation beg this basic question. For the major mode of acculturation, the direct shaping of one culture by another through which civilization develops, has been conquest. Wolf and Diamond developed different facets of Marxist social thought. Wolf viewed anthropology as a science whose essential concepts were those of mode of production and socio-economic formations as structured totalities. It underwrote the formation of a comparative political economy. Diamond saw anthropology as the study of people in crisis by the people who were themselves in crisis. Anthropology, in his view, was a humanist philosophy whose goals were to penetrate the mystifications of genocide and bureaucratic repression, to understand the dimensions of an emancipatory politics. This required taking seriously the notion that social relations characteristic of kin-ordered communities constituted an archetype for struggles toward a more just and humane social order. Dialectical Anthropology, the journal he founded in 1975, contained articles that sought to hone and refine both facets of anthropology informed by Marx's social and ethical theory. Marxist social theory underpinned a number of developments in anthropology from the late 1970s onward, the most important, thought-provoking, and influential of which were a series of studies by Marxist feminist anthropologists that examined the anthropology of work. They focus on the intersection of class, gender, and race in colonial settings as well as in contemporary capitalist third world and tribal societies. By the early 1980s, they had clearly shown, for example, that labor markets were typically stratified by gender, race, and ethnicity, that gender relations were transformed as societies became increasingly enmeshed in tributary or capitalist social relations, and that the appearance of gender inequities were integral aspects of class and state formation. The profession reorganized, 1983 to 1993. In the fall of 1982, the AAA Executive Board presented a reorganization plan to the membership of the association. The impetus for the plan came from discussions between the AAA president and those of cooperating organizations, the Society for American Archaeology, or the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, about the increasingly impersonal nature of the annual meetings and about an IRS ruling that stated that the administrative services provided by the AAA to cooperating anthropological organizations were not tax-exempt. One aim of the plan was to allow the members to create a series of groups based on shared interests or region, such as humanistic anthropology, the anthropology of work, or the Central States Anthropological Association, which would elect officers or representatives to serve on a council. The council would share governance of the association with an executive board whose members would be the presidents of cooperating organizations, the American Ethnological Society, or the SAA, and the AAA officers elected by the members of the association. The implication of this was that cooperating organizations would relinquish their independent corporate status in return for administrative services and representation on the executive board. A second aim was to enliven the annual meetings, which would be organized by program chairs from each groups. The third aim was to give voice to the growing number of anthropologists who practiced their craft outside of the academy. The SAA withdrew in 1983 from further discussions about the proposed reorganization and the implications, financial and otherwise, of its loss of autonomy and corporate status became clear. Its executive board severed relations with the AAA and established an independent administrative office. The reorganization plan was subsequently approved in separate votes by members of the AAA and those of the AES in the fall of 1983. The adoption of the plan had a number of unintended consequences for the years that followed. For example, the number of interest groups proliferated rapidly and was ultimately capped in the early 1990s. The members of the council felt subordinated by the executive board. The interest group frequently felt themselves pitted against one another for resources, such as the number of panels they could organize for annual meetings, and all of the groups objected to the cost of the administrative services provided by the AAA office. The adoption of the reorganization plan was ultimately diversive. It exuberated divisions within the association and strained relations with the SAA and other organizations. The reorganization plan also provided procedures that regulated the introduction of resolutions at the annual business meeting. Article 11, Section 4 of the proposed bylaws stipulated that new legislation or resolutions proposed by members for consideration at the annual business meeting must be received in writing by the Secretary of the Executive Board at least 15 days before the annual meeting to be placed on the agenda. Resolutions passed at the business meeting shall be subject to a mail ballot of the members. The proposed bylaw meant that it would take roughly a year to adopt any resolution introduced by a group of members. It was supported by individuals who wished to decant politics and ethics as legitimate concerns of the discipline's major professional organization. Its advocates were many of the same individuals who had supported the Meade Committee during the Thailand controversy a decade earlier. This group had long been angered by resolutions that were introduced by the Council of Marxist Anthropologists and others at the business meetings that were approved by those in attendance. These motions frequently dealt with politically sensitive topics: CIA recruitment, apartheid, and the massacres conducted by the Israeli army at Shatila and Sabra that demanded timely responses. Open political discussion and resolutions from the floor that addressed important issues were effectively curbed when this proposal was adopted in the fall of 1983. Although the bylaw was successfully challenged and amended in 1987, the AAA was effectively prevented from expressing opinions about what was happening in the world between 1984 and 1986 when it was in effect. By 1986, the business meeting had been reduced to a poorly attended, seemingly endless series of awards and reports. The divide separating those anthropologists who believed the AAA should take principled stands on issues of the day and those who preferred an apolitical professional organization was mirrored by the subjects they wrote about and the theoretical frameworks they used. If the period from the mid-1970s through the early 1980s was characterized by a canter toward Marxist social thought, then the years from the mid-1980s onward were marked by simultaneous turns towards history and postmodernism. They also witnessed the emergence of a conscious self-awareness which viewed anthropology as text and cultural critique. In his 1988 Radcliffe Brown lecture to the British Academy, Marshall Shallins was critical of the idea that the global expansion of Western capitalism, or of the world system so-called, has made the colonized and peripheral peoples the passive objects of their own history, and not to its authors, and through tributary economic relations has turned their cultures into adulterated goods. He proceeded to criticize the world system theorists for not paying attention to the history of these peoples and for denying that they possessed their own laws of motion and for claiming that they lacked any structure or system to save those given to them by Western capitalist domination. Shallins reinformed the relation between people without history and the historical expansion of the capitalist world system as a cultural process. He wrote that Western capitalism has loosed on the world's enormous forces of production, coercion, and destruction. Yet precisely because they cannot be resisted, the relations and goods of the larger system also take on meaningful places in local schemes of things. In the event, the historical changes in a local society are also continuous with the superseded scheme, even as the new state of affairs acquires a cultural coherence of a distinct kind. So we shall have to examine how indigenous peoples struggle to integrate their experience of the world system into something that is logically and ontologically more inclusive, their own system of the world. The peoples without history who resided in different places on the periphery of the capitalist world system experienced its commodities and social relations differently, and initially at least, integrated them differently into their own practices and understandings of the world. From a slightly different perspective, The capitalist global economy was organized locally by the values of indigenous communities. It was enmeshed differently in the various collectivities. In Solon's words, the capitalist forces are realized in other forms and finalities, in exotic cultural logics far removed from the native European commodity fetishism. Solon's, of course, was not the first to argue that attention must be paid to people living on the margins and the intricacies of the capitalist world. Eric Wolf had made the same point a few years earlier in his Europe and the People Without History. However, Solon's was gently critical of Wolf's work, remarking perceptively that it did not grant agency to collectivities on the periphery which were drawn into the larger system to suffer its impact and become its agents. The reason for this, he argued, was that Wolf, like many of the world systems theorists, had a reductive view of culture and saw it as a reflex of the mode of production, a set of social appearances taken on by material forces that somehow possess their own instrumental rationality and necessity. Culture, in Solon's view, was more than a function of material circumstances. It was instead historically constituted as particular peoples went about satisfying their needs. It was a code of constructed in relation to pressures of the forces of nature, and typically also in relation to pressures of other societies. Solon's was concerned with the relation between structure and agency at those historical conjunctures at the time when structural transformation occurred. In Marx's terms, he wanted to show how people made their own history under circumstances not of their own choice. In Solon's view, the history was a cultural process. Change occurred when the relations among the oppositions in the cultural code were reconstructed. He buttressed this view with information derived from Hawaii in the late 18th century. Here, the behavior of populace was shaped by a series of positions: man, woman, chief, commoner, and taboo, ritually marked, Noah, ritually unmarked. When commoners, especially commoner women, consorted with Europeans, they transgressed the taboos established by chiefs to protect their own relationships with foreigners. This had a cascading effect and quickly led to modifications of other oppositions in the cultural code. While the meanings derived from the cultural code were transformed, terms of oppositions were altered, the code itself persisted in a modified form. Christine W. Gailey was also interested in how peoples without history made their own histories. She realized the importance of culture, however, she understood culture different from Solon's. In her view, Solon's had adopted the dominant ideology thesis, which asserted that the categories of cultural code subsumed all meaning in ordered social relations. She argued instead for a more dialectical view of culture. In state-based societies, she maintained that the efforts to legitimate rulership and class hierarchy through rituals and the idiom of kinship can be considered as an assertion. The politically dominant classes represent their versions of tradition as culture, but among subject peoples, other meanings, other representations emerge or persist. Thus, culture in state-based societies is not continuously created on a consensual basis. It is an area of conflict. Where there is no open rebellion, there may be accommodation, an appearance of quietude. This does not mean that culture is thereby shared. If it were, there would be no need for the civil authorities or other non-producing classes to sponsor a litany of ritual occasions, spectacles, or other forms of public indoctrination. In other words, culture was created simultaneously in contexts where states and ruling classes attempted to extend their control over production and reproduction, and the subordinated classes and peoples resist their efforts. Culture, the meanings, values, and practices people continually renew and create to make the events and social relations of everyday life comprehensible, was one arena in which this dialectical process of class and state formation played itself out. While states attempted to organize dominant, universalizing, and homogeneizing cultures, the members of subordinated groups renewed traditional cultural forms and created alternative, potentially oppositional cultures. Gailey's view of culture as dialectic was well received by historical archaeologists who were concerned with the social origins of inequality and its manifestation in the archaeological record. It also resonated with the efforts of feminist anthropologists, notably Karen Brodkin Sachs, Brackett F. Williams, who were laying the foundations for exploring once again the linkages of class, gender, race, ethnicity, and nation. Brodkin Sachs raised two questions. Were race and gender reducible in some way to class, or were they separable and secondary dimensions of being in the context of theorizing social transformation? The impetus for her questions came from the investigations of second-wave socialist feminists who were concerned with women's unwaged labor, their efforts to theorize domestic and community-based experiences of working-class women were responses to some Marxist and labor union studies that viewed class struggle almost exclusively in terms of struggles over control of the shop floor. Brodkin Sachs focused her attention on social reproduction, how class structures were reproduced. She pointed out that the American working class had been organized hierarchically between gender, race, and ethnicity since its inception. Wage differentials existed between men and women, between whites and non-whites, and between native English speakers and immigrants. From Brodkin Sachs' perspective, the concept of social class was not a gender-neutral or race-neutral social category. Instead, a gendered, racially, and ethnically specific concept. This meant that class, racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the United States was intimately related to the historical development of capitalism. It also implied that the theories themselves were cultural constructs that attempted to explain the existing social order rather than the elements that were derived from some order imposed by the natural world. It indicated that social categories such as bondsman, slave, Indian, Negro, or Italian American possess historically specificity and attempted to address relations at particular moments. Williams noted that ethnicity rather than class or race had become in the 1970s a lightning rod for anthropologists who responded to decolonizations by shifting their attention to the study of tribes, villages, and isolated communities to that of ethnic groups and nations. While many saw ethnicity as either a cultural or a situational phenomenon, a few viewed it as a relational phenomenon associated with the process of class and state formation. Williams suggested that the ethnic aspect of any identity formation process must be understood in relation to the societal production of enduring categorical distinctions and not simply in terms of individuals adopting and shedding particular manifestations of those cultural identities. An adequate theory of ethnicity must account for the historical and contemporary ideological linkages among ethnicity and categorical aspects of identity formation processes in nation-states. Such a theory must help to reveal how the precepts of nationalism affect a. how groups assess the amount of the right blood necessary to claim membership in segmentary hierarchies of a national society, b. how the bloods of competing groups get into the mainstream of national society, and c. how much cultural change is admissible before a group based on shared descent loses its distinctiveness. Williams observed at the starting point for understanding the relationship between ethnicity and nationalism was to explore the myth-making and the material factors that motivate and rationalize its elements. In other words, how were the impure groups transformed or homogeneized into a nation possessing particular characteristics such as a shared written or spoken language? She pointed out that ideologies of nationalism and the subordinated subnational identities called ethnicity resulted from state-sponsored or promoted programs that called for the construction of myths that homogeneized social and cultural diversity. Nation builders, in her view, were simultaneously myth makers. These myths have taken myriad of forms in different nation-states. For example, real Ecuadorians are committed to bringing Ecuador into the modern world of nation-states and are perceived as belonging to a mixed race that was created as a result of a history of miscegenation. In the United States, by contrast, race and ethnicity are differentiated as the Second World War loomed on the horizon and as the descendants of immigrants from Eastern Europe were subsumed into dominant nationality and became white Americans in the process. June Nash, among others, launched studies of the articulation of the working class communities that were structured by race, gender, and ethnicity with a capitalist political economy that was being restructured by a new international division of labor. The deindustrialization of old industrial regions such as northeastern United States and the shift away from the production of standardized, mass-produced commodities to customized goods. Nash repeatedly pointed out that the political, economic changes taking place in core industrial areas such as the United States had ramifications for peoples living on their peripheries. Cultural change and resistance were everyday features of societies on the margins that were experiencing economic development, structural adjustment, and human rights violations by repressive states. While Gailey, Brodkin, Williams, and Nash, to name only a few, focused their attention on the dialectics of culture, class, gender, race, and ethnicity in state-formative situations, others were influenced by Gert's interpretive anthropology, by hermeneutic turn in French phenomenology, by rise of post-structuralism, by the ongoing relevance of the critical theory elaborated by the Frankfurt School, and by the growing prominence of literary critics such as Edward Said. In a nutshell, the proponents of these approaches believed that words were important. Words were how people perceived, thought, and talked about social life. People used words to construct social reality and to give meaning to cultural products such as a work of art or a piece of writing in contexts that were continually reconstituted with the help of words. The linguistic turn in Anglophone anthropology in the mid-1980s was simultaneously a postmodernist one, which claimed that the truth and morality, among other things, have no objective existence beyond how people think, talk, and write about them. There are no societies, no communities, or objective realities waiting to be discovered. Social life, in this perspective, consists mainly of how people think about it. And they do this in diverse and changing ways, from streams of ongoing conversation to abstract models, stories, and other representations. The foundational texts of genre were George E. Marcus and Michael M.J. Fisker's Anthropology as a Cultural Critique and Experimental Moment in the Human Sciences, James Clifford and Marcus's Writing Culture, The Poetics and Politics of Ethnography, and Clifford's The Predicament of Culture, 20th Century Ethnography, Literature, and Art. They asserted that what anthropologists wrote about others, how they represented the objects of their inquiries, often fueled dominant perceptions of non-Western peoples that maintained the uneven power relations existing between industrial capitalist countries of the West and the rest of the world in the current process of apparent global westernization. Marcus and Fisker argued that some of the experimental strategies for writing ethnographies, the self-reflective accounts of field workers as actors in ethnographic encounters, descriptions of intersubjective interactions, or efforts to use non-traditional rhetorical forms, expressed a new sensitivity to the difficulty of representing cultural differences, given current, almost overriding perceptions of the global homogenization of cultures. In their view, the distinctive method of anthropology and the core of the discipline itself was ethnography, which brought together the previously separate processes of data collecting and analysis. Ethnography was a research process in which the anthropologist closely observes, records, and engages in the daily life of another culture, an experience labeled as the fieldwork method, and then writes accounts of this culture, emphasizing descriptive detail. Such an approach was underpinned by cultural relativism and by collapsing theory with the practice of writing and producing particular textual forms. In other words, the harmonic or semi-logical form of the ethnographic text becomes an implicit theory of the social process described, or to put the problem from the point of view of postmodernism, writing practice is no longer estranged from theory. It is theory. Clifford's approach was different. He was concerned with the various literary forms that anthropologists use to establish their authority. He noted that ethnographers established their authority with two moves, initially asserting their first-hand experience with a culture, the I was there move, and then describing that culture without reference to the effects of their presence might have had on the people in question or on themselves. Thus, ethnographers were always caught up with the invention, not the representation of cultures. As a result, when Clifford described a legal case in which the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Committee sued the federal court for the possession of 16,000 acres on Cape Cod, he claimed that the identity of the Mashpee was constituted, invented, by the commentaries contained in trial transcripts and interviews with witnesses for the defense. This must have come to surprise to the Mashpee who had brought the suit in the first place. An additional problem with his approach was that Clifford did not distinguish testimony given for the Mashpee from that given for the defendant. As anyone who's watched an episode of Judge Judy on television knows, plaintiffs and defendants always have different points of view and interests. By equating theory with the practice of writing, Marcus and Fisker on the one hand and Clifford on the other avoid coming to grips in serious ways with insights of feminist anthropologists. While they question the power relations and traditionally existed between anthropologists and the other, they did not deal adequately with feminists and anthropologists who wrote from gender and class positions or subjectivities that were different from their own. As a result, many feminist anthropologists were critical of the postmodern turn in anthropology, especially of Clifford's claim that feminist ethnography has focused either on setting the record straight about women or revising anthropological categories, and has not produced either conventional forms of writing or a developed reflection on ethnographic textuality as such. Besides being factually incorrect, Clifford's statement also blurred the distinctions that existed between feminists who had adopted different theoretical perspectives. Marcus and Fisker argued that theoretical perspectives such as Marxism must be translated by ethnographic inquiry into cultural terms and grounded in everyday life. This, of course, echoed the concerns of the Frankfurt School from the 1930s onward, as well as the writings of a number of anthropologists who eschewed neither the foundational inquiries such as Marxism nor culture. They tended to view modes of production as the skeleton of everyday life and culture as its flesh and blood. One issue that brought to the fore by postmodern anthropologists was the conceptual difference between the individual and the subject. One commentator described the difference in the following way. Essentially, the term individual has an ideological weight of an entity that has a coherence, a stability, and a consciousness that transcends, gives meaning to, its cultural environment as a primary active force. By its very nomenclature, the term subject denotes an entity that is less in charge of its destiny, but that is constituted by various cultural determinations rather than being constituted of them. The subject, in a sense, is constructed not only by these outside cultural forces or discourses, but also by forces within itself that it cannot control. I have in mind here the Freudian idea of the unconscious and Lacan's linguistic revision, wherein the individual is subject to the other's discourse. The constitution of the subject and of the subjectives was, of course, the problem that occupied French philosopher and social critic Michel Foucault at different moments in his career. It should come to no surprise that Paul Rabinow, an early commentator of the postmodern trend in American anthropology, was also a leading exponent and interpreter of the Foucauldian social thought in the United States. Studies of subjectivity, the cultural construction of self and other, became increasingly frequent in the late 1980s onward. In sum, postmodern anthropology was rooted in a curious mixture of romantic and neoliberal thought. Its proponents displayed a sentimental edge of romanticism rather than its critical capacity when they lamented the subordinated positions of third world peoples in global power relations. They adopted the ahistorical central tenet of neoliberalism when they argued that identities were created not in social relations, but rather in the exchange of words and ideas between peoples occupying different places in the hierarchy of power. Its proponents stressed cultural differences at the expense of underlying structural and cultural similarities. At the same time, they also accepted uncritically the idea that the world was becoming homogeneized by the global westernization resulting from computers and telecommunications forged and from the increasing mobility of people who moved from one country to another and brought pieces of their cultures with them. The postmodernists dismissed the possibility of knowing past societies because the past does not exist independently of historians and their rhetorical use of language as they construct narratives and represent it. Furthermore, the postmodern anthropologists claimed that ethnography was the core of the discipline, was diversive, and had the potential to undermine partnership between cultural or social anthropologists on the one hand, and their colleagues in archaeology, linguistics, and biological anthropology on the other. It was rooted in ultimately flawed ideas that also underpinned the formation of Harvard's Department of Social Relations after the Second World War. In the mid-1990s, such views underwrote the balkanization of anthropology in departments at Berkeley and Stanford and fueled acrimonious debates within the American Anthropological Association as the organization sought to reassert the unity of the profession. Thus, the fields of reference for critique and politics mentioned in the titles of the postmodernist books were not imperialism, colonialization, or capitalism, rather what was happening in university departments and in the profession. By viewing identities as texts that were created by intersubjective communication, the postmodernists decanted concerns about class politics and struggle from anthropology at the time when states around the world were becoming increasingly repressive, and their neoliberal policies allowed transnational corporations to suck the life out of workers, peasants, and tribal peoples. Anthropology and globalization after 1994. By the mid-1990s, globalization had become not only a fashionable term, but a substitute for the word imperialism, but also a central issue for American anthropologists. Today, globalization is used in three different ways: to refer to 1. A state of international economic integration and interdependence, 2. The expansion since the 1970s of international flow of goods, factors of production, and finance, and 3. The integration of economic interdependence and economic flows through market-based intercourse. In the first sense, globalization is synonymous with colonialism and imperialism, processes that were already in evidence by the end of the 17th century. The second meaning recognizes the greater financial and trade integration that existed during the middle third of the 20th century, and that tacitly acknowledges the similar levels existed from the 1890s through the 1920s. The third meaning focuses on the novelty of the current situation, but does not necessarily posit the emergence of a new stage of international capitalism associated with the cultural logic of post-modernity. Since globalization has a number of different meanings, let us briefly consider what it is not. Most neoliberal boosters of globalism have argued that a free market enveloping the whole world began to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s as a result of the spread of the modern technologies of industrial production and of communication. They also presume that the economic life of every nation could be refashioned in the image of the American free market. They further presume that as these nations modernized, they would adopt Western liberal democracy and values and would consume increasing quantities and varieties of Western goods. As the world's nations were enmeshed and increasingly integrated into the global economy, their cultures would converge toward that of the United States, and the world's cultural diversity would be diminished by capitalist modernization and the homogenization of consumption. Conservative commentators on the idea of global capitalism, such as John Gray, have pointed out that globalization was not the end product of free market forces and that it did not imply convergence. The homogenization of the world's cultures, or even the adoption of American-style liberal democracy. They have recognized, like the Marxists, that capital flowed across boundaries precisely because of the differences that existed between localities, nations, and regions, and that the process of globalization has accentuated rather than diminished uneven development. They have also recognized that nations are integrated in varying degrees and in different ways into an increasingly internationalized capitalist economy dominated by Japan, the United States, and Western Europe. As a result, the free market was spawning new types of capitalism at the same time as it was propagating new types of political regimes. Radical commentators on the concept of globalization, such as economists Paul Sweezy or Samir Amin, have argued that it masks imperialism and the uneven development of capitalism, and that the processes involved in globalization are not new to the late 20th century. This shield makes it difficult to study the historically specific processes that have produced and are producing that unevenness, and obscures the ways in which the inhabitants of localities and regions have responded to those circumstances. Amin has pointed out that globalization has involved the crystallization of capitalist production around regional growth poles. As a result, nations on the periphery, the Third World reconceptualized as the South, have different possibilities for change and development with those in industrial core areas. Globalization creates difficulties for countries on the periphery because these states have different capacities to isolate capital and their citizens from the effects of being integrated into a world capitalist system. Like their conservative contemporaries, the radical commentators also recognized that alternatives to neoliberal policies were possible and desirable. From the mid-1990s onward, George Marcus, Michael Fisker, and Michael Kearney, among others, published synthetic articles dealing with the processes of globalization. Their essays dealt in different ways with the fact that people are very mobile. Each year, millions of them cross national boundaries in search of work, to sample culture in museums, or to find pleasure in theme parks. They were concerned with how to comprehend people who have one set of social relations in their local communities and another set of relations and understanding after they have moved to a different locality in the capitalist world system. Marcus described the problem in methodological terms. Ethnography moves from the conventional single-site location, contextualized by macro constructions of larger social order, such as the capitalist world system, to multiple sites of observation and participation that cross-cut dichotomies such as the local and the global, the life world and the system. He contrasted two modes of ethnographic inquiry. First was the traditional method that involved observations at a single site and developed by other means its context in the world system. The second, which is self-consciously built on the intellectual capital of Post-Modernism, arose in part from interdisciplinary investigations, such as feminist, media, or cultural studies. Its practitioners believed that the world system is not the theoretically constituted holistic frame that gives context to the contemporary study of peoples or local subjects closely observed by ethnographers, but becomes, in a piecemeal way, integral to and embedded in discontinuous, multi-sided objects of study. Cultural logics, so much sought, are always multiply-produced, and any ethnographic account of these logics finds that they are at least partly constituted within sites of the so-called system. Modern interlocking institutions of media, markets, states, industries, universities, the world of elites, experts, and middle classes. Strategies of quite literally following connections, associations, and puntive relations are thus at the very heart of designing multi-sided ethnographic research. An important implication of multi-sided ethnography, according to Marcus, is that the anthropologists will have to give up their exclusive focus on subaltern subjects positioned by systemic domination, and to consider in addition other sites of cultural production in which questions of resistance and accommodation would be subordinated to different sorts of questions about the shape of systemic processes themselves and complicities with these processes among variously positioned subjects. Such a perspective would allow ethnographers, for example, to see how migrants became members of diasporic communities, or how things shifted from resources to gifts to commodities within the world system. Fisker indicated that anthropologists had to confront a number of challenges in the area of the capitalist world system, glossed variously as late modernity, post-modernity, post-industrial society, knowledge society, or information society. At a methodological level, these challenges included the techniques of multi-sided ethnography for assessing different points and widespread processes, the ways in which multivocal texts map the situedness of knowledge, and acknowledging that anthropological representations are inventions within a stream of representations, mediations, and unequally inflected discourses competing for hegemonic control. It was important for anthropologists to confront the challenges in a milieu shaped by the importance of science and technology, the effects of decolonization and the reconstruction societies after trauma, and the new role played by electronic and visual media. Like Marcus, Fisker advocated making use of the insights gained in new fields, such as cultural studies or social studies of science. Part of his reasoning was an effort to connect with the theory and methods of American anthropologists who worked either in other fields or outside the academy altogether. Marcus and Fisker also were concerned with the activities of anthropologists who, along with experts, elites, and middle classes, were active agents in the world system and constructed representations of that system. Their representations were constituted in light of their own experiences, position, and understandings of the system. The representations interwove with those of individuals who had the same or different subjectivities. Knowledge of the system as a whole was constituted on the basis of ongoing debates among individuals with different situated knowledges and different positions in a hierarchy of power relations. Marcus and Fisker also pointed out correctly that ethnogenesis occurred when the members of communities, including American anthropologists, had to confront new circumstances. What they failed to stress sufficiently was that the ethnogenetic processes and circumstances encountered by one community might be different from those encountered by others. For example, the members of the rising and declining factions of American middle class have had quite different experiences in the 1990s than those of their contemporaries in Rwanda or Kosovo. Thus it is essential, I believe, to distinguish the experience of an upper-class woman from Japan who was touring New York from those of a poor teenage girl from a Thai village who was sold into the sex trade in the Middle East. Marcus and Fisker acknowledge the importance of class structures and then turn away from them, opting instead to analyze identity politics rather than class struggle. In another context, Leith Mullings has written that the postmodernist concern with culture, identity politics, and new social movements is in part a reaction to the failures of liberal integration, in part a consequence of the state-sponsored destruction of the left, and in part a challenge to apologists for inequality who attribute the cause of increasing poverty to the culture and biology of African Americans and other peoples of color. If the goal of anthropology is to examine the various socioeconomic and political factors that have shaped the practice of anthropology in the United States, then adopting the theoretical pluralism advocated by some feminist writers becomes useful in this regard. Sandra Harding and others have argued that constructivist critiques, opposed to other viewpoints, provide space for developing new understandings of the discipline, its often unstated premises, and the socio-economic and political foundations. The common thread of their critical analysis is a concern to articulate an account of knowledge production that recognizes its own contingency and standpoint specificity, that repudiates any quest for a unitary master narrative, and any faith in the context-transcendent foundations, and that yet resists the implication that any comparison or judgment of credibility is irreducibly arbitrary, that anything goes. The advantage of such constructivist techniques is that they do not conflate issues or problems emerging from the analysis of the global system with those that arrive from particular theoretical foundations or with the practice of anthropology in a particular national context. At the same time, they afford opportunities to examine the interplay between theory and practice on one hand, and the analyses of the capitalist world system on the other. Such critiques do not have to separate contemporary practices and interpretations from historical development. They do not have to treat the interpretations of anthropologists as a literary genre. They do not have to accept the claims about the assets and or liabilities of certain transcendental analytical categories. They do not have to accept the claims that assert that, since meaning is culturally constructed, different cultures, even those in the same society, are incommensurate and can certainly not be understood by a Western observer, even one skilled in the art of interpretation. They do not have to accept the claim that, since all knowledge is subjective, all efforts to discover objective knowledge about the current capitalist system are doomed to fail. Kearney was also concerned with the movement of people, capital, commodities, information, and symbols in the global and transnational spaces. However, he eschewed the relative standpoint adopted by Marcus and Fisker and argued instead that it was necessary to pay attention to the relations and processes that take place within and transcend nation-states, because studies that were exclusively limited to local processes, identities, and units of analysis yielded an incomplete understanding of the local. He advocated focusing on the political economic underpinnings of the movement of people and things. In doing so, he pointed out the importance of distinguishing between global and transnational aspects of the processes involved. In his view, global processes were decentered from particular national spaces, whereas transnational processes occurred in and emancipated from particular nation-states. Globalization implies more abstract, less institutionalized, and less intentional processes occurring without reference to nations. Whereas the terms transnational focuses attention on the cultural and political projects of nation-states as they vie for hegemony in relations with other nation-states, with their citizens and aliens. Globalization concentrates on the universal and impersonal, whereas transnationalism draws attention to the political and ideological dimensions of processes. Kearney recognized that different states, the United States and Mexico, have different positions and play different roles in the global political economy. Kearney's perspective also recognizes that agency is not restricted to experts, elites, and middle classes. In his view, members of the lower classes were also active agents who strive to shape their own destinies and to overcome the structural limitations imposed by local manifestations of global capitalism. This was an important distinction between his work and that of others on the one hand, and on the other that of Marcus and Fisker, who locate the motors of social and cultural change in the thoughts, understandings, and actions of the experts, elites, and middle classes. The political economic perspective advocated by Kearney and other anthropologists opens up possibilities for examining the myriad processes that accompany transnationalism and globalism and that occur variously at different local, national, and transnational levels. A number of anthropologists have considered the relationship between nationalist projects of subject making and capitalist political economy. Karen Brodkin, for example, points to the articulation in the United States of the capitalist project of creating a labor force and various ethno-racial projects in which workers are simultaneously constituted as national subjects, men and women, native and foreign, and white and colored. Ai-Hua Ong and Donald Nonini take a slightly different tack and look at the activities of relations of Chinese transnational capitalists in the Asia-Pacific. They suggest that two variants of capitalism are associated with the Chinese transnationalism. In one, Chinese transnational capitalists act out flexible strategies of accumulation in networks that cut across political borders and are linked through second-tier global cities. These overlapping business, social, and kinship networks stitch together dynamic, productive, financial, and marketing regions that are not contained by a single nation-state or subject to its influence. In the other, Chinese transnational capitalists flourish not only outside the straitened space of the nation-state, but also within it, aligned closely to non-Chinese and to a lesser extent Chinese state bureaucratic elites and joint ventures with state capital. Much of the new capitalism in the Asia-Pacific is state-driven, state-sponsored, and Chinese transnational capitalists, like those in other parts of the world, represent forces that nation-states can deploy and discipline to strengthen themselves. Lynn Steffen takes a third tack in her analyses of the interplay of class, local forms of exploitation, and the reconstruction of ethnic and national identity in Chiapas and Oaxaca in southern Mexico during the 1990s. The privatization of land formatted by NAFTA and the Zapatista rebellion form the backdrop of her discussions. Her focus is on the ways that peasants and rural proletarians are making their own history and recasting ethnic and national identities in contexts shaped by the heightened state repression and armed resistance to its interventions. Peasants and rural proletarians from ethnic groups whose relations were sometimes antagonistic as recently as a decade ago or so, because they were pitted against one another by the ruling classes of the region and the state, now find themselves having similar experiences and a common cause against their oppressors. Anthropologists employing broadly political economic perspectives have also begun to criticize conventional theories of the state which stress legitimacy and political power and see it as a set of institutions that can make and enforce laws. Carol Nagengast, for instance, raised questions about the interrelations of violence, terrorism, the crisis of the state, and human rights. She rightly pointed to the fragility of the states. She wrote that the ideal state is one in which the illusion of a single nation-state is created and maintained, and in which resistance is managed so that profound social upheaval, separatist activity, revolution, and coups d'etats are unthinkable for most people most of the time. The state thus attempts to ensure conformity to encompassing unitary images through diverse cultural forms and an array of institutions and activities that, taken together, help to determine the range of available social, political, ethnic, and national identities. The crisis of the contemporary state springs from its differentially successful monopolization of power and the contradiction between it and the demands of the peripheralized peoples who, through resistance, have created new subject positions that challenge fundamentally the definitions of who and what ought to be repressed. When consensus fails, ethnic or political opposition, which is otherwise suppressed or subtle, becomes overt. The state, of course, cannot allow this to happen. Nagengast proceeds to point out that there was a veritable explosion of violence in the 1990s and a concomitant rise in human rights abuses as nation-states disintegrated or as states lent their force of arms to one side or the other in these conflicts. Violence in this perspective is not a characteristic that is present or absent in some social group, but rather situated within the practices, discourses, and ideologies that states employ differentially within social and political relations to buttress themselves and maintain power. A political economic perspective sensitive to culture, both as an integral aspect of ethnogenesis and as an area of class struggle, has also underpinned studies concerned with a variety of issues. These include, for example, the formation of ethnic and national identities, revolutionary movements, the state repression of Indigenous peoples, the position of Indigenous peoples at the end of the millennium, and the formation of transnational border communities.